Hello. This presentation is again on organic macromolecules, but it is limited to just one category, and that is carbohydrates. Your study guide asks you to state 3 uses of carbohydrates in the human body. The main principal function we think of with carbohydrates is that they are a source of energy, either to be used right away or to be stored. But there are many more functions. They're also found in cell membranes and are part of DNA. And lastly, cellulose, a complex carbohydrate, we cannot chemically digest, but it's used as dietary fiber to maintain a healthy intestine and to keep the contents of the intestine moving. So the functions of carbohydrates would be nutrition, energy storage, DNA structure, cell membrane structure and function, and dietary fiber. Your study guide also asks you to identify 5 monosaccharides that are important to the human body. In that study guide, it's not specified whether I'm looking for you to know large, complex carbohydrates or if smaller ones count towards the 5. My opinion is that you should be familiar with all of the carbohydrates listed on this table. Glucose and fructose are actually monosaccharides. They're both a primary source of fuel for cells. Sucrose, or common table sugar, is used in baking, and it is actually a disaccharide, which means that it's made up of 2 subunits or 2 monosaccharides. Now, DNA structure has a carbohydrate called deoxyribose, and it's a monosaccharide, but DNA in and of itself is a polymer, so that's a little bit tricky. The rest, glycogen, starch, glycolipids, and cellulose, those are all big complex carbohydrates. We're going to look at the structure now of individual monosaccharides and how you're going to be able to recognize what a carbohydrate looks like. So first you're going to need to be able to recognize that monosaccharides make up carbohydrates and consist only of 3 elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Because of this, we often call monosaccharides hydrates of carbon, because for every carbon atom there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. All monosaccharides have a few number of carbons, 3, 5, or 6. They don't get bigger than that. And then there's hydroxyl groups attached to the carbons. The chemical structure on the left, the bottom of the slide, shows a monosaccharide with 6 carbons. And the diagram on the right shows a monosaccharide with 3 carbons. Now the one on the left is harder to decipher because they've kind of used organic techniques for drawing. And just try to remember that everywhere you see 2 lines intersecting, there's a carbon. So there's a carbon there, 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 oops, and up here in the carboxyl sort of group. And then your last or 6th carbon is right there. Okay. Now let's look at 5 monosaccharides that are important to the human body. Okay. First is a 3-carbon monosaccharide called glycerol, and it's shown on the left. Secondly, there's 2 5-carbon monosaccharides in the middle diagram and on the right. These are ribose and deoxyribose. Both of these are called pentoses because they contain 5 carbons. Remember, you can't necessarily see the carbons because they are at a spot where 2 lines intersect. So deoxyribose has 4 carbons in a ring, and the 5th carbon is up here. The same is true of ribose. Okay? So ribose is found in RNA, and deoxyribose is found in DNA. And the main difference between the two is simply that deoxyribose is missing an oxygen, and this occurs at carbon number 2, where you just see a hydrogen attached, not an OH. That's how it gets its name. So now for functions. Glycerol has several functions, but what you will see later in the course is that glycerol is kind of an intermediary at one step in a chemical pathway that the cell uses to make ATP. So you'll just see that it's created in a cell later on as kind of a step towards a more important molecule. But in addition, glycerol forms the backbone of triglycerides, and fatty acids attach to each one of those carbons. And when we get to those instances later in the course, one is this week, one is much later, I'll point that out, that, oh, here's glycerol, the 3-carbon monosaccharide. The other group of monosaccharides that we're going to look at contain 6 carbons. For this reason, they're called hexoses. And there's 3 of them: glucose, galactose, and fructose. Now notice that the chemical formula for all 3 of them are identical. They all contain 6 carbons, so they must all have 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. Well, how can they be different then, is the question. Well, what makes them different is the arrangement of the atoms. So you might notice, for example, that fructose only has a ring made up of 5 different atoms, okay, regardless of whether the atoms are carbon or not. So it's usually pretty easy to pick out fructose. Glucose and galactose are hard to tell apart, but it has to do with the orientation of where the hydroxyl groups sit. Do they sit above or below this certain plane? Just so you know, you will never have to distinguish between glucose, galactose, and fructose. Okay, you will not have to do that. But you should recognize that they're monosaccharides. You should do that. Now, because they have the same chemical formula but a different arrangement, structural arrangement, we call them isomers. Now let's look at some more complex carbohydrates, or polymers. The ones we looked at previously are called simple carbohydrates. You might be familiar with that terminology. It comes from nutrition. Simple carbohydrates are either monosaccharides like glucose, or a disaccharide with just 2 maltose as an example. Complex carbohydrates, there's usually many monosaccharides. So here we've got 6 monosaccharides linked together. Some common disaccharides, back to simple. Sucrose, I've mentioned before, is the combination of glucose and fructose. And maltose, which was on the previous slide, is just 2 glucoses. And lactose, which you find in dairy products, is a glucose and a galactose combined. And these bonds that link the monosaccharides in a carbohydrate are called glycosidic bonds. I don't think that's in your study question, though. Just so you know, there's a name. There's always a name, right? So some common polysaccharides, which are definitely complex, include cellulose, starch, and glycogen. The only one of these three found in animals is glycogen. And glycogen is just strings of glucose bound together into a polymer and stored in the liver. So when blood glucose is low, the liver can break down this glycogen and release glucose into the bloodstream. Cellulose and starch are both found in plants, and cellulose is really quite compact and linear. We can't digest it with enzymes anyway, but it's good for fiber. Starch, you'll notice, has a lot of branching, a lot like glycogen. So what is really the difference? It is the degree of branching. That's the main difference between what you find in like potatoes for starch and what you find in our livers. Okay, that's all for carbohydrates. Our next lecture deals with proteins. Thank you.